Imagine a massive, incredibly costly territorial war. Like a conflict that permanently alters the map, costs hundreds of thousands of dollars, forces entire communities to just dismantle their homes, and leaves dozens dead in this brutal guerrilla campaign.
Right, a really heavy, intense conflict.
Exactly. Now imagine this war is named after a fearsome, legendary leader. You'd think he's the ultimate mastermind, right? But here's the striking historical contradiction. That leader spent almost the entire conflict hundreds of miles away from the battlefield, actively trying to negotiate peace.
Which is, I mean, it sounds like a glaring continuity error you would find in a poorly researched movie or something.
Totally.
But it is actually one of the most defining and honestly misunderstood moments in the history of the American West.
Well, we are jumping right into another deep dive. Today, we have a massive stack of historical sources, university theses, and contemporary Native American perspectives, mapping out a really volatile 19th century collision in the Great Basin.
Yeah, it's a fascinating stack.
We are exploring the 1853 conflict universally known as the Walker War. But as we peel back the layers of this geopolitical powder keg, we are going to look at why it absolutely should be called Wakara's War.
Right.
And why history stubbornly attached his anglicized name to the bloodshed anyway, plus the incredibly complex reality of the man himself. So for you listening, if you love digging into how history is framed, packaged, and sometimes entirely mislabeled, this story is a masterclass.
It really is. And to really grasp the stakes here, we have to look at the Great Basin in the late 1840s and early 1850s. Because this wasn't just, empty, pristine wilderness passively waiting for westward expansion.
Right, that's the myth.
Exactly. It was a highly contested, multipolar geopolitical space. You had ancient, heavily armed Native American equestrian empires colliding head-on with the newly arrived Mormon pioneers. And the gravitational center of this whole collision was Wakara.
Okay, let's unpack this, because
Right.
even his name is a lesson in how history gets overwritten by the victors. The Anglo-American settlers called him Chief Walker. That is the name stamped on the history books in the war. But his actual name was Wakara.
Right. Wakara actually means yellow or brass in the Numic language, which is the indigenous language family of the Great Basin. And it's a name he likely earned due to his preference for wearing striking yellow buckskin.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that detail.
Yeah, it's a cool detail. He was a prominent leader of the Timpanogo's Ute, specifically the San Pete Band. But the title the settlers gave him, chief, is a fundamentally flawed label.
How so?
Well, modern Ute historians and descendants really caution against using that term because it projects a European concept onto an indigenous structure. Like, chief implies a permanent monarchy,
Right.
a king who exerts total top-down control over his subjects at all times.
Yeah.
And Ute culture simply didn't operate that way.
Right. I was reading through the descriptions of his operations, and if he wasn't a king, what was he? I mean, my initial thought was to compare him to a CEO of a massive logistics empire.
Yeah, I could see that.
But even that implies a permanent corporate hierarchy, Based on what you were saying about Ute culture, would it be more accurate to think of his leadership like a modern venture capitalist, or maybe the head of a freelance collective?
I think that is a much better framework, actually. Ute leadership was very situational and meritocratic. Leaders were chosen by consensus for specific tasks based on their expertise.
So it changed depending on the need.
Exactly. During a major fish harvest, the community followed a leader who knew the rivers best. During a conflict, they rallied behind a war captain. If a leader lost the confidence of the people, or the specific task just ended, their authority diminished.
That makes a lot of sense.
Right. Wakara was groomed from childhood for leadership, and he had capital-meaning weapons and incredible strategic vision. So people chose to follow him on specific, highly lucrative ventures. And his power was fundamentally rooted in his mastery of the horse.
And he didn't just master the horse, he built an economy around it. I mean, he was nicknamed the Hawk of the Mountains. By the 1840s, Wakara dominated the old Spanish Trail. He extracted tribute from anyone passing through his territory.
Literally anyone.
Yeah, and his horse raids into California are legendary. There is a report in our sources of him taking up to 3,000 horses in a single season from wealthy California rancheros.
3,000. It's wild.
But wait, the texts keep referring to him simply as a horse thief. Stealing 3,000 horses across state lines doesn't sound like petty theft. Logistically, how does one even pull that off?
Calling him a horse thief completely diminishes the scale of his operation. I mean, this was a sophisticated international trade network that integrated the Utes into a global market spanning from the Pacific coast all the way to Santa Fe.
Wow.
Yeah. Moving 3,000 horses across the Mojave Desert and the Great Basin requires staggering logistical coordination. You need advanced knowledge of hidden watering holes, pacing the herd so they don't starve, defending against pursuing Californian militias.
Because they were definitely chasing them.
Oh, absolutely. And negotiating safe passage with other tribes along a 1,200-mile route. It was a massive military and economic enterprise.
But the sources also confront a very dark reality about how this enterprise was funded, because Wakara's empire wasn't just built on moving horses. It was deeply reliant on the native Indian slave trade.
Yeah, it was a brutal economic engine. On his way to and from California, Wakara's well-armed equestrian forces would conduct raids on more sedentary, unmounted tribes in the Great Basin,
Right.
specifically targeting Paiute and Gosit women and children. He would capture them and transport them to Spanish slave markets in places like Santa Fe, exchanging human lives for guns, ammunition, and more horses.
And looking at the historian Max Perry Mueller's work in our stack, there is an interesting distinction drawn between settler Indian slavery, which treated people purely as objects of labor, similar to chattel slavery, and native Indian slavery.
Right, there is a nuance there.
Yeah, in Wakara's system, captives were sometimes adopted into the tribe or married into it to build kinship networks. But he also sold countless individuals to the Spanish, condemning them to brutal lives as field hands or house servants.
Exactly. Wakara utilized this deeply entrenched system to bring his band to the absolute summit of their regional power. He controlled the trade, he controlled the trails. But then, in 1847, a completely alien operating system is introduced into the Great Basin.
The pioneers.
Yes, Brigham Young and thousands of Mormon pioneers arrive in the Salt Lake Valley.
This is where the story shifts. You have two massive powers expanding in the same basin. You would think Wakara, with his heavily armed equestrian force, would immediately view them as an existential threat and just fight them off.
You would think so.
But instead, he invites them in. Why invite colonizers into your territory?
Well, to Wakara, it was a highly strategic business calculation. In the late 1840s, he actually encouraged the Mormons to settle in places like the Sanpete Valley. Yeah. He viewed these new settlers as a lucrative new market for his horses and a steady source of manufactured goods, guns, cattle, and food. He was essentially trying to franchise his trade network.
He even gets baptized into the Latter-day Saint faith in 1850. They baptize him in Manti City Creek, ordain him as an elder, and rename him Joseph Walker.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this moment perfectly encapsulates the massive cultural misunderstanding unfolding in real time.
How so?
The Mormon leadership viewed Wakara's baptism as a profound act of religious submission. To them, it was a crucial step toward fulfilling their theological goal of bringing Native Americans into their fold, making them, according to the religious language of the time, white and delightsome.
So they thought he was conforming.
Exactly. They assumed he was abandoning his Ute identity to assimilate into their hierarchy.
But Wakara didn't view baptism as a mechanism that erased his identity. For him, spirituality and political alliances were fluid. He was weaving another strand into his political web, right? Associating with the Mormon power structure to boost his own standing. But this uneasy alliance shatters because of the physical, boots-on-the-ground reality of colonization. Mormon settlements start completely re-engineering the local ecosystem.
And the ecological devastation was incredibly rapid. Mormon settlers weren't just building log cabins, they were fundamentally altering the hydrology of the region.
Yeah, the water system.
They diverted streams for irrigation and set up continuous netting across rivers. This decimated the local trout populations, a food source so critical that scholars refer to it as Wakara's fish.
Wow!
Furthermore, their expansive agricultural footprint and grazing cattle destroyed traditional Ute hunting and gathering grounds. The land simply could not biologically support both the Ute way of life and the rapidly expanding agricultural footprint of the pioneers.
So starvation sets in among the Ute bands.
It does. It becomes very desperate.
And then the legislative hammer falls. In 1852, Brigham Young and the territorial legislature legally outlaw the Spanish Ute slave trade, actively driving the Mexican slave traders out of the territory.
Which severs the economic lifeblood of Wakara's empire. He relied on that specific trade to acquire the weapons and wealth that maintained his influence.
Now, if you were listening and wondering how the Mormons justified this, because the historical records reveal a massive, glaring legal loophole, here it is fascinating.
It really is.
The Mormons ban Wakara's slave trade because they publicly view it as cruel and barbaric. But simultaneously, they pass an act for the relief of Indian slaves and prisoners. This law instituted a system of indentured servitude and adoption. How did this actually function on the ground?
It functioned by cutting Wakara out entirely. The Mormon settlers began purchasing or coercing Paiute parents to give up their children directly to Mormon families.
Directly to them.
Yes. The settlers framed this as a humanitarian effort to purchase them into freedom and civilize them through indentured labor in Mormon households.
So they dismantle Wakara's primary economic engine, take the underlying commodity, the captive children, for themselves under a different legal label, and destroy the local food supply in the process.
It's a perfect storm.
The tension is at an absolute breaking point. Wakara is furious. His people are starving. And all of this systemic pressure finally detonates in July 1853. Over 3 trout.
It sounds trivial in isolation, but those 3 fish represented the sheer desperation of the Ute people.
It's July 17th, 1853, in a settlement called Springville. A Ute woman goes to the cabin of a settler named James Ivy. She is trying to trade 3 large trout for a small amount of flour, likely because her family is starving due to the ecological destruction we just discussed.
Right, and her husband, a Ute man named Showerokats, who is actually a relative of Wakara, is furious that she accepted such a meager amount of flour for the fish.
Yeah.
He begins to violently beat her right there in the settlement.
So James Ivy intervenes to pull the man off her, and a brutal physical struggle breaks out. Showerokats grabs his rifle, Ivy grabs the barrel, and in the wrestling match, the gun actually snaps in half.
Just completely breaks.
Yeah. Ivy uses the heavy metal barrel to strike Showerokats on the head. Then another Ute man shoots an arrow through Ivy's shirt, so Ivy knocks him out too.
Total chaos.
Total chaos. In the middle of it, the Ute woman, the very person Ivy was stepping in to protect, picks up a piece of firewood and strikes Ivy in the face, slicing his lip open. Ivy strikes her back. The fight ends, but a few hours later, Showerokats dies from the blow to his head.
And this localized tragedy instantly becomes the spark that ignites the region. Because this wasn't just a homicide, it was a violent collision of 2 entirely incompatible justice systems.
Right, because Ute tradition demanded a specific mechanism of justice called blood atonement or retribution. To restore cosmic and societal balance for the life of a Ute, a Euro-American life had to be taken.
Yeah.
So they demanded the settlers hand James Ivy over to them to face execution.
The Mormon settlers, however, operated under Anglo-American common law. From their legal framework, James Ivy acted in defense of another person, and then in self-defense during the struggle. Handing a man over to be executed without a trial for defending a woman was unthinkable to them. They categorically refused.
The local militia rides up Payson Canyon to try and negotiate, but they find the Ute warriors in an absolute rage and are forced to retreat. The very next day, the Ute retribution is exacted.
That happens fast.
Arapeen, who is Wakara's brother and a highly prominent war leader, rides into the town of Payson and shoots a Mormon guard named Alexander Keel dead.
And the band immediately flees into the canyons, firing on cabins and driving off stolen cattle as they retreat. The conflict is officially underway. The militia mobilizes. Brigham Young issues defensive orders.
So the territory plunges into war. But here's where it gets really interesting, and it's the central mystery of this deep dive. Where is Wakara? Where is the Napoleon of the desert whose name is plastered on this conflict?
Wakara is actively suing for peace.
Wait, really?
Yes. Almost immediately after the violence ignites, he sends messages attempting to de-escalate. When his angry warriors, led by figures like his brother Arapeen, refuse to listen to his counsel, Wakara physically removes himself from the theater of war.
He just leaves.
He spends the vast majority of the 1853 to 1854 conflict hundreds of miles away, wintering down in Navajo country or up in the Uinta Valley.
Which brings us back to the core question of our mission today. If he wasn't there, and he actively opposed the violence, why on earth does history call it the Walker War?
It comes down to how Euro-American observers fundamentally misunderstood indigenous structures, combined with the need for a recognizable brand.
A brand.
Yeah. The settlers projected their own hierarchical military structures onto the Utes. They assumed that because Wakara was the most famous, powerful leader of the band, he must be secretly orchestrating the raids from afar.
Oh, I see.
They couldn't compute the venture capitalist situational leadership model we discussed earlier, the idea that Wakara could simply step down from leadership if the consensus went against him. Furthermore, Euro-Americans needed a recognizable figurehead. The Walker War gave the conflict a clear, famous villain that could be easily reported back to Washington, D.C.
It is a historical label of pure convenience. But even with Wakara gone, the severity of the war for the settlers was catastrophic. Brigham Young institutes a massive, territory-wide defensive mechanism called forting up.
And we really need to understand the physical toll of fording up. Young ordered settlers living in outlying farms and small, spread-out villages to literally dismantle their log homes, move the materials into central locations, and construct massive, heavy mud and stone forts.
Imagine the psychological and economic crush of that. You are a farmer. Suddenly, you can't tend your crops. You have to tear down your own house, move into a cramped, unsanitary fort with dozens of other families, and become an armed guard.
It's devastating.
The sources estimate the war cost the territory upward of $200,000, which was an astronomical, crippling sum in the 1850s.
It was. And it was a grueling guerrilla conflict fought in the canyons and valleys. Ute raiders targeted the economic lifeblood of the settlements, driving off hundreds of cattle and ambushing men who were sent out to haul lumber. The atmosphere was one of extreme paranoia and tension.
And that paranoia bred tragedies that had absolutely nothing to do with Wakara's band. For instance, the infamous Gunnison Massacre in October 1853.
Right.
A U.S. Army topographical engineering party led by Captain John Gunnison was brutally ambushed and killed. The historical records confirm this was carried out by members of the Pavant tribe who were seeking their own revenge for a murder committed by a passing emigrant wagon train.
Totally separate incident.
It wasn't Wakara's people at all, but because it happened in the middle of this heightened paranoid atmosphere, it all got lumped into the terrifying narrative of the Walker War.
Because the conflict was causing such profound disruption to both the Mormon settlements and the Ute people who were facing devastating starvation and displacement, as the harsh winter set and the desire for a resolution finally outweighed the desire for retribution.
People were just tired.
Yeah. And since Wakara had never wanted this war in the first place, he eventually returns from the Navajo country to use his remaining diplomatic leverage to end it.
Which brings us to May 1854 to a place called Chicken Creek in Joab County. The visual of this peace negotiation is incredible. Governor Brigham Young and his massive, heavily armed entourage arrive at Wakara's camp to sign a treaty.
Yep.
But Wakara, in a brilliant display of political theater and sovereignty, refuses to step out of his tent to greet the governor.
It was a highly calculated move.
Right.
Wakara knew the Utes were in a weakened position militarily, but by forcing Brigham Young to dismount and come to him inside his tent, Wakara was visually asserting that he was not a conquered subject surrendering to a master.
He was a peer.
He was a sovereign leader negotiating with an equal.
Young recognizes the explosive tension of the moment and checks his own pride. He and his apostles walk to Wakara's tent, and when they step inside, the political posturing suddenly drops away.
He shifts completely.
Because they find that Wakara's daughter is severely ill. In an incredibly poignant human moment amidst all this bloodshed, Young and his companions give the Ute leader's daughter a religious healing blessing.
And it breaks the ice. Wakara, ever the shrewd negotiator, agrees to peace, but he extracts significant promises. He demands food, guns, and annuities of cattle and horses over a 20-year period in exchange for the lands the Mormons are occupying.
Wow. Did they agree?
Well, the federal government never formally ratified this as a land cession treaty, but the immediate goal was achieved. The large-scale violence stopped.
But the peace was just a brief armistice. Less than a year later, in January 1855, the Hawk of the Mountains suddenly dies. He catches pneumonia, though rumors persist for years among the Utes that the Mormons poisoned him.
His death really marked the absolute end of an era for the Ute equestrian power in the Great Basin. Without his unifying visionary presence, the bands became increasingly fractured and marginalized.
And even his burial became a weapon of historical framing. Contemporary historical accounts from the settlers claim his entombment was like a savage Egyptian pharaoh's. They reported that his favorite horses, 2 of his wives, and captive Indian children were slaughtered and buried alongside him in a mountainside tomb so they could serve him in the afterlife.
Which is an intense image.
But modern Ute descendants strongly push back on this. They argue that while horses may have been sacrificed, the tales of human slaughter are grossly exaggerated stereotypes designed for a very specific purpose, to justify the colonization and seizure of their land.
This raises an important question about what historians call inverted conquest.
What does that mean exactly?
It is a psychological mechanism where the colonizing settlers frame themselves as the innocent victims of savage aggression, rather than the people whose expanding footprint was actually causing the displacement and starvation. By painting Wakara as a bloodthirsty warlord, even in death, it mentally absolved the settlers of the systemic destruction of the Ute economy and culture.
And that erasure wasn't just on paper. Wakara's grave, a deeply sacred site, was repeatedly robbed by treasure hunters over the next century. His remains, his very skull, were stolen.
It's awful.
It is a haunting metaphor. Here is a man who was undeniably a founding father of the American West. He built massive trade routes, shaped geographic boundaries, and dominated an entire region. But to make way for the grand, sweeping narrative of manifest destiny, the idea that European expansion was preordained and righteous Wakara had to be removed.
Erased.
First from the land, then from his grave, and finally his true story was removed from the history books.
Replaced by the Walker War. A conflict using the wrong name, blaming him for violence he tried to avoid, and entirely ignoring the deep systemic mechanisms that actually caused the bloodshed.
Like the ecological destruction.
The ecological destruction, the economic strangulation, and the clashing legal systems.
So what does this all mean for you listening? Why should you care about an 1850s skirmish over 3 trout, stolen horses, and a misnamed leader? Because it reveals the exact mechanism of how history is packaged and sold to us. You are living in an era of absolute information overload, where headlines and simple labels are constantly deployed to obscure, incredibly complex truths. The Walker War is the perfect historical warning that the title of an event can be a complete misrepresentation of the facts on the ground.
It demands that we look past the convenient labels and ask, well, who assigned this name, and whose perspective is being conveniently left out of the narrative?
Which leaves us with a final thought to mull over. We've spent this time talking about how linguistic misunderstandings and cultural projections created massive conflict in the 1850s. But fast forward to today, consider how many modern legal disputes over Native American land sovereignty, water rights, and jurisdiction in the West are still governed by treaties signed under those exact same circumstances.
That's a huge point.
If a historical conflict was built on a fundamental mistranslation of what leadership and property even meant, how much of our modern legal landscape is still resting on the fragile foundation of those same 19th century misunderstandings? Next time you look at a map of the West, ask yourself what else was lost in translation.